Thanks, Marc-Andre, for those kind words, and thank you so much to all of you for joining. I'm normally just a regular attendee at these co-op conversations, which I always really enjoy. And so I hope that I'll be able to continue the tradition of generating interesting discussions during the breakout groups. So I began exploring rural issues about a decade ago through my work with the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. And this was on the Cooperative Innovation Project. And we wanted to understand whether and how rural and Indigenous communities in Western Canada could address their economic needs through the development of co-ops. And one of the major insights I had during that project is that co-ops might not only be able to effectively address people's economic needs, but in the way that they do, they may also be able to address their social needs and possibly even build social cohesion within and across communities. So we're going to return to this idea again in the breakout groups. The Co-op Innovation Project wrapped up in 2016, shortly before the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump as the US president. And after these events, I think it is fair to say that there was an explosion of research focused on trying to understand and explain what had occurred. One of the major explanatory factors that emerged was the rural-urban divide in voting patterns and partisan loyalties. So for instance, in the US, urban voters were more likely to support the Democratic Party, while rural residents were more likely to vote for the Republican Party. And in particular, were more likely to support so-called far-right populist candidates. And it's important to recognize that polarization is not in and of itself a negative phenomenon. If you look up the dictionary definition of polarization, it's simply a process that divides people into two contrasting groups with a divergent set of opinions and beliefs. And political polarization can actually lead to a strong and healthy democracy. It can enhance inclusion by addressing imbalances in political representation for marginalized and underrepresented groups. And we also know from extensive social psychological research that group diversity can lead to much better decision-making. It's a lot more concerning when polarization spirals into what political scientists Jennifer McCoy and Murat Summer refer to as pernicious polarization, which is a type of polarization that divides societies into us versus them camps based on a single dimension of difference that overshadows all other cross-cutting ties between these groups. And this difference becomes a dividing line that extends into everyday social relations between people. So those viewed as the other are treated with fear, suspicion, and distrust, or even worse, disgust, contempt, and hostility. And a group marker of social identity becomes the proxy for who is part of us and them. For instance, the identity marker could be liberal versus conservative, woke versus alt-right, Indigenous versus settler, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, or in the case of the topic today, rural versus urban. And the danger is when the polarization process starts to take on a life of its own, at which point it's really difficult for us to undertake interventions to change course because we begin associating more with those in our like-minded bubbles and segregate ourselves from people in the other group. And we justify these actions through the adoption of dehumanizing and moralizing language, for instance, about us as good and the other as evil. So in the wake of Trump's election, US academics became more interested in why rural-urban polarized voting patterns had emerged and whether rural and urban markers were just good proxies for traditional social cleavages around race, class, and religion, or whether rural and urban explained something entirely unique and different. So for instance, Catherine Kramer and Robert Wuthnow asserted that there was an emerging rural consciousness and social identity that was grounded in an economic and cultural alienation that had turned into a politics of resentment against perceived urban elites. Since then, several popular writers in the US have talked about how this rural-urban partisan divide has developed into a much more pernicious type of polarization, with negative implications for US democracy and social cohesion, and the potential for escalation into violent confrontations, such as what occurred on January 6, 2021. So what about Canada? I've been talking a lot about the US. Well, until recently, much of the political science literature in Canada had focused on the religious, ethnic, linguistic, and regional cleavages that have historically been much more salient in Canadian politics. And when the rural-urban cleavage has been explored, studies haven't generally found major differences between rural and urban areas in terms of vote choice, political values, and policy preferences. Some researchers at the University of Saskatchewan, Dave McGrain, Lolene Burdell, and Scott Bell, highlighted that this could be in part because suburban residents, even around major metropolitan cities like Toronto, have much more in common with rural areas in terms of political attitudes and social values than they do with people living in downtown Toronto. So we definitely need to think about the problems in using binary categories like rural and urban. However, a recent study by Armstrong, Lucas, and Taylor looks again at the rural-urban cleavage and historical federal voting patterns in Canada. And they show that rural residents are today much more likely to vote Conservative, while urban residents are much more likely to vote Liberal. And that this divide existed in the 1960s, but has become much more durable since the early 2000s. And interestingly, there was also a rural-urban divide back in the 1920s, but at that time, the Liberal Party was actually the rural party, and the Conservatives were more likely to represent urban ridings. What's also interesting is the NDP have generally been able to garner support from both rural and urban areas and residents, though there are some rural-urban divides in NDP support in specific provinces. So even though there's now a much more durable political polarization in Canada in terms of vote choice between rural and urban residents, some other Canadian studies have shown that rural and urban residents still don't actually differ that much in terms of their values and policy preferences. But we do perceive these differences to be much greater than they are. So why is this the case? Well, part of it is because there are people who benefit from amplifying perceived polarization, division, and conflict. Comparative political scientists McCoy and Summer claim that, quote, pernicious polarization arises when political entrepreneurs pursue their strategic and political objectives by using polarizing strategies, such as mobilizing voters with divisive, demonizing discourse and exploding existing grievances, end quote. But it doesn't just end there. It doesn't just take one side. It worsens when opposing political elites fail to effectively respond in a non-polarizing manner, or worse, they respond with their own polarizing tactics, and that just ensures that the cycle continues. So when society is in a pernicious spiral of polarization, it's never just one camp that's to blame. Donald Trump is often, and probably fairly, given as a prime contemporary example of a politician who's both contributed to and benefited from perceived ideological polarization in the US. But in the 2016 election campaign, Hillary Clinton reciprocated with polarizing tactics in her use of dehumanizing language when referring to Trump supporters. And closer to home in Canada, Justin Trudeau contributed to and benefited from this kind of approach as well when he strategically used COVID-19 vaccine mandates as a wedge issue in the 2021 federal election, in his use of highly incendiary and inflammatory language to describe the unvaccinated. And the Conservatives, for their part, failed to de-escalate that rhetoric. And it wasn't just politicians. Media in both countries benefit from and encourage this kind of segregation of the unvaccinated. And this led to a spiral of pernicious polarization. And to be fair, most of us were in states of fear and high anxiety. And when we're in those states, we actually further retrench into our camps. And as we know, a lot of this came to a head during the trucker convoy in Canada. And I gotta admit, I also contributed to the escalation of rhetoric through my often completely ineffective and sometimes very emotional responses during the pandemic, especially towards those who were advocating vaccine mandates and segregation of the unvaccinated. And it's one of the reasons why I've deleted my Twitter account. And it was really humbling for me to realize that no one is immune, not even academics. And it was at that point I decided I really wanted to understand this process of pernicious polarization, what factors contribute to it, and how we actually might work to interrupt it. And as we moved out of the pandemic, I became increasingly concerned that the framing of the rural-urban polarization divide, which was starting to creep into Canada from the US media, might start to create more pernicious polarization because we actually were amplifying the perceived divisions. But I was also concerned about how to study this because, as I mentioned, and as I saw myself and many of my colleagues during the pandemic, academics can quite easily and with the best of intentions also contribute to the pernicious polarization spiral. So as a researcher, I was trained in the hardcore positivist tradition. The objective researcher swooping in to come to study, identify, and reveal the truth of the science for other people and interpret it. And it took me some time to accept that in studying and reporting on some kinds of phenomena, social scientists not only contribute to the manifestation or change in the pattern we're studying, but we can even become part of the problem we're trying to address, especially when we're not aware of our motivations, our underlying assumptions. Those underpin the questions we ask, how we design our studies, and affect our findings and interpretation of results. So I was fortunate at this time to have the opportunity to work with Dr. Clark Bannock from the Alberta Centre for Sustainable Rural Communities. And in the process, I learned about a study. He had actually sort of taken some of the methodology from Catherine Kramer's work in Wisconsin, but he undertook a study in rural Alberta in a community where he would visit every day for several weeks on end. And he asked rural residents if he could join some of their regularly occurring coffee conversations. And I took a major step outside of my comfort zone as a quantitative researcher, and we designed an ethnographic research project where we adapted this method of deep listening and actually adapted it slightly to include where we actually went and lived or immersed ourselves in these rural communities across Canada for approximately 2-week periods of time. So we're still doing this research. We show up at bars, restaurants, coffee shops, churches, legions, town halls, food banks, civic centers, fairgrounds, and we sit with groups of people. We ask them questions. We listen to what they want to tell us, what they talk about their communities and social circles and families, and how they make sense of political, cultural, and social issues together in their own communities. And a couple of early insights are emerging from this work. And one thing that really surprised me, especially because I looked at the census data prior to going into some of these communities, is that these communities are incredibly diverse, not just in terms of age and ethnicity and religion, but also in terms of cultural values and political and policy opinions. And you don't get that sense when you're simply looking at the census data, or surveys of attitudes or analysis of voting patterns. And another surprising finding was that there was a real notable absence of conversations about federal politics or politicians, even when we specifically asked people about those issues, though there were many discussions about local elected politicians and concerns with local government. There also wasn't a lot of what I felt to be animosity or deep-seated sense of resentment about urban areas or people. And while some rural people expressed annoyance at the recent urban implants, they called them, moving in and trying to change things or jacking up the price of housing, most would in fact talk about the city in quite neutral ways. For instance, they needed to make an upcoming trip to the specialist or visit their granddaughter who was going to university there. And what was also really interesting is sometimes what rural people conceived as the city was actually not this big metropolitan center that we think about. It was some smaller place that would normally be coded in a public opinion survey as rural itself. So with the caveat that we're still collecting and analyzing the data, based on what I've heard so far myself in these rural communities, I would tentatively say that I think some of our assumptions about rural and urban folks and communities are overly simplistic. I don't think that we're currently in a spiral of pernicious rural-urban polarization in Canada. But I will acknowledge that it's possible we might have just visited unique communities. They're not at all representative of rural Canada. And this is one reason why we're now in the final stages of trying to design a large nationally representative survey on rural-urban polarization, where we want to try and explore further some of the insights that are emerging through our community visits on a larger scale, and also to actually explore some of these ideas across both rural and urban spaces. But again, I've raised this before, we want to be cautious when trying to undertake this more so-called generalizable research, because surveys can be problematic and they can lead us to believe things about rural and urban folks and communities that don't match reality. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I mentioned already measurement of who is rural and who is urban and how you categorize that. But also there's things like the tyranny of averages and small numbers in rural communities, which I don't have time to get into in this talk. But a major one is that in finding simple correlations between binary categories of rural and urban and certain types of political opinions and attitudes, we start to begin to essentialize people who live in these communities. We start to come to believe that they have innate or dispositional differences across rural and urban, rather than understanding how important the historical, cultural, and policy context is for us to actually interpret what any average differences mean and how people come to make sense of these issues. It's always so much more complex than any can be quantified in any single question or scale. And I think we really need to always be careful with our interpretations of these quantitative numbers, because we might not have the whole picture, or we might actually have to have the humility that we may just be wrong. So one example, in one recent US study on the reasons for increasing rural-urban divide, a conclusion that they came to that rural residents demonstrate more anti-Black racism than urban residents was based on one single question that asked people whether the government in Washington should help improve the economic and social conditions of Black people. And responses ranged from the government should make every effort to Blacks should help themselves. And this question mixes up at least two kinds of possible attitudes, those on race and those on government support. And it isn't really possible to say from that question whether rural people are more likely to demonstrate racial animus if they're also more likely to be in favor or less likely to be in favor of any government support for anyone. And you can't tease that out from that question. So we're currently spending a lot of time right now thinking about what questions to ask and how people will perceive them and how to explore this issue in all its complexity. And this is one of the questions I'm going to throw to you to consider in the breakout group. So how do we do this in a survey, or is it even possible to do so? And the other question we're going to have you discuss is the role of co-ops in all this, in all of this kind of conversation. And to set up that conversation, I just briefly want to make a few last points about the ways in which we insulate ourselves from going down this pernicious rural-urban spiral. Most suggestions that I've seen that people have made, especially in the Canadian context, is that it's important for governments to develop inclusive policies that consider the realities and diversity of rural communities. So this idea that no one size fits all and we need place-based approaches. Other people have proposed making changes to our voting system for proportional representation. Other people have suggested ensuring that increasingly urban located journalists cover rural stories and issues. And I'm not at all opposed to any of these suggestions. I think everything, is up for discussion and debate. But I also think that most of us don't have much influence over these things. And I think there's a lot of things that we can learn about how rural communities and residents themselves actually avoid the pernicious polarization that we may be able to scale. So something that surprised me from my rural community visits was just how much interaction rural people actually have with those who have different values and opinions to them. And the reasons for this are both structural and relational. There are small numbers of people in these communities, so this makes the diversity there that much more visible. And since everyone knows almost everyone, at least as an acquaintance, you can't really avoid most people. So you're polite and tolerant even when interacting with those you have fundamental differences of perspective with, because their sister was childhood friends with your sister, or you might need to hire them next year to replace your roof. The other thing is that there's limited spaces in rural communities for people to gather and socialize. So these spaces, when they exist and they're more open, accessible, inclusive, like in one community, the Tim Hortons coffee shop, they become sites of exposure to different ideas because everybody gathers there. So again, what implications does all this have for co-ops? One major thing that I have found that co-ops do is they do reduce potential rural economic alienation by creating a way for rural people to access goods and services that they might not otherwise have. But co-ops do so much more than this. They also provide the spaces for people to come together to engage in democratic deliberation. And they both allow and require us to sit in the tension of these differences and conflicts that arise when you bring together a diverse group of people. And co-ops help people work through their differences by focusing on a shared pragmatic problem, which can really transcend identity-based differences. And co-ops have the potential to facilitate positive social connections and interactions across people in these different identity groups. And specifically with regard to rural-urban polarization, many of our larger co-ops in Canada operate across these geographic boundaries, facilitating connections and movements of people and products within and across rural and urban communities. And they do this more so than almost any other organizational form in our country. So you can think about the co-op retailing system as one example. However, I think co-ops can also undergo internal polarization themselves among their membership, and the rural-urban marker can be a factor that explains some of this potential division. And in fact, there is some research that shows that when co-ops are unable to productively manage and navigate conflict that arises from increasing member diversity, that it becomes more difficult to sustain the co-op as well. So just in summary, co-ops are a potential tool and a local one that I think we all have much more control over than federal policy or media coverage, but we still need to think intentionally about how our co-ops can both contribute to insulating us from pernicious rural-urban polarization, but can also possibly contribute to it in different ways. And I look forward to having that discussion during and following the breakout groups, and as well as hearing what most of you are interested in when it comes to understanding further this topic of rural-urban polarization in Canada.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dionne. That was lovely. And there's so much to unpack here. I do want to use a bit of my prerogative to give us just a quick chat before we break out. You know, I was really happy you mentioned this idea that sometimes the academic community can be kind of partly responsible for these things. And I was going to kind of raise that. I know a lot of the credit union sector is my area of research, and you've heard for years this notion of bifurcation, big and small. And what that does is it brings to life that. It doesn't just reflect it, it starts anchoring it concretely. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about causality. And I'm thinking Harold Innis, Marshall McLuhan, these were communication theorists who argued that the scope of empires are a function of the media that we live in, and that are dominant at the time. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the role of the modern media apparatus to these tensions, whether it's pernicious or not. So let's go there.
So I think, Marc-Andre, honestly, you're the expert on media communications and that kind of thing. So my stuff is really just going to be sort of armchair sort of theorizing about this. But I actually, when you talk about causality, right, I think this is something like I was trained in that tradition, right, where you can actually identify a causal effect. You could say this leads to this. And increasingly, as I've sort of kind of progressed in my academic career, I've come to realize that actually it's sort of a system, and you can sort of decide where you want to kind of make an intervention and where might be the most effective way to sort of stop cycles. But I sort of see it as an interconnected web or system. And I think it is more difficult to think about it as X causes Y. And so I think it is more effective possibly to think about it in these as sort of a system, or all of these kinds of different domains as interacting with each other, the concept of wicked problems, right? And so it becomes less about what causes what, or who did what first and who did what second, but it's this cycle, and where do you actually intervene to change the pattern? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And maybe just a really quick follow-up. In your ethnographic work, when you were out in community, did you hear people talk about social media and how it's kind of playing in their lives? Did that come up at all?
So that is there is actually some emerging insights around social media. One that I find interesting is we always talk about how people can say whatever they want on social media because it's more anonymous. In rural communities, people will see the person the next day at the grocery store, and that has different implications for how they interact on social media. It's not that they aren't falling prey to the same kinds of issues we all face on social media, even in a more anonymized form, but they generally, when they say something, they know that the people that they're going to see the next day are going to have read it. And that actually comes out, there's council meetings where that has become an issue. It kind of can escalate in the communities around some of the rhetoric that happens, but people will directly address it, and they know who each other are talking about. And so that has, again, back to the structural difference of rural and urban communities. The social media space, I think, also plays out a little bit differently because of those structural realities.
Fantastic. Okay, so Dionne mentioned that co-ops can create these spaces for conversations, and in fact, our co-op conversation is all about that. So we want to hear from you now. We're going to address Dionne's questions. We're going to break you out into groups. Before we do that, just a word about how this works. We're going to give you about 12, 15 minutes. I'll decide when I cue Natalie. And when you go into those rooms, please introduce yourselves. If you don't know who each other are yet, do some introductions, spend a few minutes getting to know each other, and then we'll get you to engage with the questions. And Natalie's going to put these questions in chat if she hasn't already. Natalie, you're working on that. And as soon as they get into the chat, we're going to break you out, Natalie, to groups of 4-ish for 12 minutes, let's say. A question, just raise your hand. Natalie and I will be monitoring the hand raises, but also the chat. You can use the chat as well, and we'll try our best to catch you. So let's open it up. Who wants to go first? And if you want, just open your mic and just jump in. That's also an option. Hopefully that doesn't lead to chaos.
I'll jump in. This is William Nelson,
Go ahead, Bill.
zooming in from St. Paul, Minnesota. I cringed, Diane, when you mentioned Trump. But anyway, Maria, I think Marcia and I were just in a group talking about some of the things that should be included in any kind of a survey. And one, of course, is access to the internet, broadband. Medical health is another one, which in more and more is dependent on access. And then the third one is labor, availability of labor. And she and I share common interest in the importance and value of migrants, and we need to get over this bias against them. But that's my opinion. I think she would agree. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Dionne, do you want to react to that?
Well, it's interesting. Like I think back to sort of some of the perceptions we also have based on survey opinion researches. I think for one, like this idea, if we think about the rural-urban divide, that people think that people in rural areas are less less open to immigration, and I have not found that, for instance, in my rural community visits. In fact, actually, there's a lot of nuance to this conversation and some of the results that we're going to be publishing on this. But I think that that's one of the misconceptions, actually. And again, there's going to be diversity across people, across communities. But this is, I think, one of those things where the tyranny of the averages matter. And that actually there's a lot, even in the Building Inclusive Rural Communities book project, I'm not saying there's not anti-immigrant sentiment and that it doesn't exist and that there aren't spaces of exclusion in rural spaces, but I actually think it is far more trumped up than the reality. So that's, I think, my only response, maybe.
Thank you, Dionne.
I just wanted to add in one. So we actually, in that survey, because I have the opportunity of working with Marc-Andre and Dionne on it, we actually are asking about access to medicine because I come from the Canadian Centre for Rural and Agricultural Health. And so we have a series of questions in the survey already specifically related to health and access to health, access to specialty care, access to emergency services, these sorts of things. And there is a general question around broadband access as well. So thank you for raising those.
Thank you, Merle. Okay, I see Eric has his hand up, and then Merle also put something in chat. So Dionne, I'll get you to react to Eric's question, and then while you're waiting for that, take a look at what Merle wrote in chat, and we can address that as well. Go ahead, Eric.
Thanks, Marc-Andre. Yeah, thanks, Dionne. My thoughts are somewhat scattered, so I'll try to keep my question general. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your research in light of some demographic trends, specifically the sort of depopulating of rural areas in sort of urbanization. And I don't want to lean into sort of the myth of like rural spaces as empty spaces or anything like that. But there's data on the fact that people are moving away from rural places to urban places. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a couple of things. One is that in the Building Inclusive Rural Communities book, by the way, which is available open access at the University of Alberta Press website, there is a chapter actually there about the sort of demographic shifts over time between rural and urban spaces. And there is a specific focus too, actually, on immigrants and also sort of Indigenous and settler. So there's some of the demographics there, also some breakdown by age. So that's actually a good chapter to go if you want the actual numbers. And I would sort of agree that if you look at sort of on average, the general shift, there's been a clear move in urbanization of Canada. That being said, again, back to sort of this idea of the homogenous kind of idea of rural versus urban, there is massive differences across rural communities. So some rural communities are really on this slow sort of like basically going to die out. My hometown is probably one of those, unfortunately. But there are also some of the communities we visited have there's been new life breathed into them because of two trends. One actually was the out-migration from urban centers during the pandemic. One or two of the communities in particular have had a massive influx of people from urban centers and that's caused a whole variety of complexities and challenges. And the other sort of trend actually is that, especially in some regions of the country, there's been a huge influx of recent immigrants to rural areas for a variety of reasons. And not just all sort of temporary foreign workers either, which is often what we think about sort of in the agricultural space. So this is actually back to sort of the discussion around immigration, creating a whole host of different kinds of conversations. And actually in some communities, there's actually a more positive attitude towards the immigrants who have come into the communities than the children of the people who are long-term residents, who they perceive a very, very big difference in work ethic. And so that is like a really interesting dynamic that's also coming out. So I wanted to kind of raise that because it really, I think the variation across rural communities is quite substantive. And so it's hard to kind of say on average, I think you're right, the urbanization is a definite trend, but I still think there's some kind of counter trends that are occurring that are changing some of that. And also that to Merle's point,
yes,
I definitely, I think this question of who people trust, because back to this idea of like us versus them, like if it starts with sort of a distrust, right, of the other. So do rural and urban people not trust each other, right? That's an interesting question. Like, and how do they conceptualize each other? Do they conceptualize each other as less trustful, or as less as being able to be less trusting of people in that other group? It'll be interesting to find out, and we definitely will have questions around that.
So Dionne, because I was in that group, and this came from Garth originally, it was also about which sources of information you draw, and which sources do you trust, and so that was the
I also do already have some of that data from another study, actually. So yeah.
Okay, Claire has her hand up. Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I think part of our team was asking who's our audience, because that would affect the way we ask the questions. So we weren't really clear about that, but I think we would want to be very specific in talking to people and just straight up ask them, what do you think the polarizing issues are between urban and rural people? Or go further and say, do you believe there is a divide in values, issues, or challenges facing rural or urban communities? We felt that maybe getting to the values part with maybe a bit separate from specific issues might be somewhat helpful in understanding how people saw the world and their frame. And then the second part, we think co-ops often are participants in things like meetings of agricultural societies in the rural areas here in the city of Saskatoon. The co-op also has annual meetings, etc. So they're part of that conversation, and it helps, I think, people understand what the pain points are for co-ops in those two different settings, or what their challenges are. And the third is that a co-op member for all of these groups, a membership and the capacity to participate in the board allows them the opportunity to develop leadership skills.
I think those are excellent points, Claire. Also, so one brief sort of comment and response, because I think it's all very, well said. When you say just ask them, like, I love that, right? Just ask people. I think sometimes in the past we always think, oh, we got to kind of ask around these things, but we have more open-ended questions on this survey that are planned than I think, or actually trying to get people to elaborate on why they answered a question in a particular way, rather than just sort of the close-ended responses for this reason as well. So to try and tease a little bit more out about the complexity, and that's sometimes a challenge on surveys, but we're hoping we get a bit more rich information for that reason as well.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question we can squeeze in. Does anyone want to take a stab at this? One more question? Oh, there is a question in chat here, Dionne. Economics plays a strong role. Financial sustainability, smaller centers. Could co-ops play a role if you assume profit is arguably with less focus, right, from that economic perspective?
Yes, I think that thing about co-ops is they have both an economic and a social purpose. I mean, you could argue all organizations to some extent do, but I think co-ops, it's really embedded in the formation and the way that the creation of it and the governance of it. It's just kind of always, the relational aspect is always there, but co-ops, like they generally, there needs to be a need, right, of some kind that's a shared need. And it's usually economic in nature or material need, not always, but most of the time that sort of galvanizes and then sort of facilitates that process. So, and yes, definitely, because co-ops can have a multiplicity of objectives, right? It doesn't just have to be profit or the maximization of profit. That can be helpful as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dionne. And if everyone can put their virtual hands together for Dionne, thank you, Dionne, for an engaging session. I know our conversation was wonderful. Thank you all for participating in this conversation today. Just a note, a reminder, we're going to send a recording out when Stan returns from vacation on March 18th. So it'll be a little delayed relative to our norm, but be patient, you'll get it. Our next co-op conversation, always on the first Wednesday of every month, is going to be on April 3rd. And we're going to feature Dr. Machi Kunzaguta, who is currently a Living Skies postdoctoral fellow at the Centre with us at the University of Saskatchewan. And his title of his talk is going to be Cooperatives and Food Security in Africa. And we're going to look at, or he's going to look at, the potential for cooperatives to support food production in smallholder agricultural farms in East Africa, an area of the world which has acute food security issues. This talk is part of a larger multi-year research international project led by Dr. Carol Henry, Robert Tyler, and myself at the University of Saskatchewan, that's called Enhancing Food Security and Livelihoods, especially for women and girls in sub-Saharan Africa. So registration will be coming soon. Natalie's going to share the link in Zoom. And thank you all for a wonderful conversation. Have a great rest of your day.